Hi, welcome to Living Well in Montana. I'm Corby Skinner, the host of the program, and this program is an outreach of LIFTT, which is Living Independently for Today and Tomorrow. And LIFTT is an organization that serves 18 counties in southeastern Montana to help people with disabilities find ways to live better and happier in our region. We have a very big topic today that covers not only people with disabilities, but people that have found themselves in disasters. And certainly with the flooding that happened in eastern Montana recently, we're familiar with certain tragedies and disasters. So today we have two people from FEMA with us today. We have a media specialist, Tony Mayne,
Yes.
and Mike Houston. An added caveat to this show is that Mike is deaf. So we also have someone helping sign so he can understand what my questions are. Welcome, gentlemen. Welcome to the show. What an interesting tie-in to have you here as a deaf person, also dealing with how people deal with disasters. So you are actually based in Denver?
Yes, that's correct. Both of us are. Yes.
Yeah. Well, welcome to Montana.
Oh, it's been awesome.
Thank you. So, one of the things that we discovered at LIFTT is that oftentimes people with disabilities have even more issues when it comes to circumstances like disaster. Imagine not being able to hear a siren or not being able to move out of your home quickly if you're in a wheelchair, disabled. So disasters are particularly important for people with disabilities to understand what they can do and being prepared for that. You obviously must deal with that.
So my position as a disability integration specialist in Delhi State and then in disasters with disability integration advisors, it came about because of Katrina. There were in the ninth quarter, in the ninth ward and the French quarter, there were a number of senior citizens, people in wheelchairs, a lot of them drowned, and that they didn't really have a plan for them, and so Congress passed what was called the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, which then mandated FEMA to hire a disability coordinator to advise the administrator of FEMA. And the way headquarters works, they create policy, and then we have 10 regions. We are part of Region 8, and it covers the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. We develop relationships with our states and our local jurisdictions, tribes, and community-based organizations like LIFTT. So our job is to help raise that awareness of the variety of folks, the whole community, and what their needs are. And I would think that, like myself, my parents are deaf. I had a head injury when I was 5, so I'm completely deaf, and 75 in my right ear, so legally deaf. I can still talk, which throws people off. But that being said, you're right. There are some resources I can take advantage of that my mom can't. So can I speak for her? I mean, I have my perspective, but she needs to have a voice. If she's in a wheelchair or if you have medical constraints, maybe a total hip replacement, whatever the case may be, there are a variety of scenarios that are impacting people on a day-to-day basis that are exacerbated in disaster response. And then obviously part of the recovery is how do we improve the community kind of back the way it was pre-disaster.
Mike and Tony, I'm sure you're aware that just 2 weeks ago was the celebration of the 32nd passing of ADA. And a lot of times when people think of ADA, it's like a good sidewalk for wheelchairs, or maybe there's sign language at the theater. But often people don't think about disasters and how that impacts people even more so than an average household or home.
Yeah, disasters can really affect a community and homes, because you always think when a disaster affects a community, just look at the flooding here with the Yellowstone. People lost their homes, farmland's gone, the river changes. But you also have to look, how does it affect the individual homeowner or the renters, people who live in those communities? Those are things that we try to have, and we reach out to the local emergency managers to plan for that, because you have to plan for the people in your community, but also as a homeowner, as that person, you also have to have a plan for yourself. You have to have a way to know if this happens, because we're in wildfire season. What happens if a fire comes? What are you going to do? If you can't hear a siren, as you were saying, you can't see the lights flashing or somebody knocking at your door, what are you going to do? How are you going to protect yourself? How are you going to escape?
Or, if I may add real quick, is do you have a car? Maybe you're home-based, you're retired, and you depend on folks to come deliver Meals on Wheels, personal assistance, what have you, and I'm independent that way. But take that away from me and tell me I need to go somewhere else. I might be able to get there, but wherever I go, is that maintaining the resources that I depend upon prior, are those available at the place that I've evacuated to? Does that then cause a secondary disaster, if you will, because I don't have those maintained? That kind of deteriorates my health. And I say my, meaning anyone's, right? So there are a lot of factors. So planning and preparedness is really critical. But as we're currently in a disaster, so the opportunity to learn from this disaster, what worked, what didn't, what can we take away from it, so that the next time we go back and are better prepared. Okay.
I have good friends that have a cabin at East Rosebud Lake, beautiful community, and the flood washed out 2 bridges. So if people were there, they couldn't get out, and the same people couldn't get in. And so when electricity was down, all the freezers are going to go bad, all the food is going to go bad in bear country, as you can imagine. Right. So we don't always think of all the parts of how disasters affect us. It's very unique.
So you mentioned power outages. There are a lot of people who depend on power outages for their independence. They might use nebulizers, oxygen. They might need cold, the insulin and things of that nature. Whatever. There's a lot of maybe wheelchair charging and things like that. And in Puerto Rico during Hurricane Maria, there was a 9-month plus power outages. People had a plan. They had generators, they had gas, but they didn't plan for 9 months. And so they didn't have oxygen, and then there's those portable tanks. What's interesting is Irma impacted Miami and Tampa, which were the suppliers of the island for those portable tanks. So people unfortunately lost their lives because they had a plan, but they didn't think about the scenario of a 9-month power outage. So yeah, there are so...
It's all linked.
It absolutely is, absolutely correct.
One other thing you don't always take into consideration is, let's say we're able to get the people out of their homes and we get them to a location like a community center or recovery center. Do they have the infrastructure to support them at that community center? That's a big thing.
Tell me a little bit about FEMA in terms of, is there an office in Montana? What is the structure sort of FEMA?
Right now here in the region, as Mike was saying earlier, this is Region 8, and we're over 6 states, the Dakotas, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. Our central office is in Denver. But we do have liaisons that live and work in the different states, and they work with the local emergency management at the state level, and we work with our partners in the state so that we can help them prepare and get ready for a potential or upcoming disaster.
So does FEMA work with, say, the Red Cross in a community, or what organizations do you know of in Montana that you can turn to for help?
We always say start local, because if, like in this disaster we had here with the flooding, the first thing, FEMA's not going to be there on day one. First, the governor has to make a request to the president for a major declaration. So we just don't show up. We just don't show up uninvited. The governor has to make an emergency declaration to the president, and when the president declares that declaration, and depends on what kind of declaration, that opens up different spigots, different response levels. So for here in Montana, it was an individual assistance and a public assistance declaration. Difference between the two: the public assistance declaration, that goes and that helps local communities, tribal governments, the state, cities recover their infrastructure. It's like here in Billings, for example, the water was so high it impacted the water treatment plant. They turned off the power. There's power outages, things like that. All those things are things that we can help assist with. To come in and help the local community, the local disaster emergency services to recover from that. But then you also have the individual assistance. And the individual assistance are for the homeowners and for the renters and some business owners too, because then we set up locations like disaster recovery centers. Like right now we have one over at the United Way of Yellowstone County on Overland Avenue. And you can go, if you've been affected by the flooding, you can go there and get assistance. Those are the kind of things we do.
And my role in this, if I can just add real quick, as an advisor, is Section 504 of the Rehab Act says no qualified individual with a disability may be excluded from facilities, programs, services, funding.
So, Mike, that's your specific role at FEMA.
Yeah, so we, in Blue Sky Days, I try to build capacity relationships at the state to help understand the whole community makeup, right? Whether at the state level, the counties, the cities, down to the neighborhood, to the individual homes. But in FEMA, for their public-facing activities, for public assistance, whether it's IA, hazard mitigation, you mentioned Red Cross, that's typically more state-driven. We do maybe fund some resources, some supplies, if you will, to help them. We don't necessarily manage that. American Red Cross does that. It's a nonprofit organization. We have what's called Voluntary Agency Liaisons. ESF is an emergency support function. That's part of the Department of Human Services in Montana. So anyway, I digress. But in the FEMA things, as they go forward, I look at their actions. I look at the analysis of the impact of the population, what the gaps might be, and then I make sure that we have resources and or equitable type deliverables, if you will, to tweak our delivery to make sure that nobody is periphery, nobody is marginalized. They have an opportunity. I can't force them to come here, but I can look at it and say, this is what we need to be equitable, and then make that messaging, come on in, we want to meet your need. We've supplied you with these resources to make it more accessible for you, and try to be as equitable as we can in the process.
That's very interesting, because I first got involved with LIFTT during COVID, and the organization realized that they couldn't bring clients into the office. They had trouble going to visit clients. How do you provide services when access is limited? The other thing that I became aware of, in a rural state like Montana, we're serving a huge population that's very isolated. And they may be isolated physically, they may be isolated electronically. So again, that impacts people. And then having a disability in a rural community is sort of a double whammy, But ADA says that you should have equal rights to services.
Right. For Title II, state and local government, they have a requirement. They have a responsibility to plan for their jurisdiction. So that's what we do in Blue Sky Days. We try to raise that awareness. We use disasters and things of that nature to help talk about how do we build capacity. But people need to be their own voice. So at the end of the day, what I like to do is kind of create that roundtable of subject matter experts, people who are seniors, people who have disabilities, people who are deaf, people who have languages, whatever the case may be. I don't have a car. I'm a single mom. I have one job. I depend on the schools and daycare. If all that's gone, I can't go to work, blah, blah, blah. So that roundtable of experts, subject matter experts, that's what we try to build. But in a disaster, we try to look and help those that have been specifically impacted by that disaster.
So if you're just joining us today, this is Living Well in Montana, a program of LIFTT, Living Independently Today and Tomorrow. And we're talking about understanding disaster recovery with two representatives from FEMA. So So we're talking about disaster recovery for all people, but also how it affects people with disabilities. So tell me a little bit more about, maybe anecdotally, about how the flood has impacted people in Montana. Or do you know stories of what are the requests you're getting?
Oh, well, I can just tell you from my experience, I've been here since June, and in June when I arrived around the 21st, we did joint preliminary disaster assessments with the state and also from other teams from outside of the state, including one team from Florida. And then we went and we verified the damages that were reported up by the state and the local areas. So I got a chance to visit 4 counties. And I saw, and there was 2 types. So I did the public assistance and also individual assistance. And the individual assistance PDAs, as we call them, the preliminary disaster assessments, I went to Fromberg first. And being able to talk to some of the people and see the impact of the water. You're seeing water lines that are almost 2 feet high, and you're talking to them like, there's water. It came from places we never seen it before. And even here in Billings, having a chance when we were getting a chance to see how the water affected the different infrastructure. How high was it the sewage plant, the water treatment plant? They had to, they were talking about shutting off the power just to make sure that they didn't have a power outage, a long-term power outage, things like that. And then just seeing the riffraff and the banks being washed away. And one gentleman I was speaking with, he said at this point, the highest he's ever seen the water was 15.5 feet. At this flood, it hit over 16 feet in some places. So that's pretty high. So you can really see how it was affecting, and that's just the cities. But then going out to Treasure County, going out to Sweetgrass, going out to Stillwater, and seeing how the water affected the irrigation districts and some of the smaller, more rural communities. Those are the things you see that they may not have the same resources in the smaller communities that they have in the larger areas. But we're here to help. That's why we're here. We're here to assist the recovery for the state, for the local community, but also for the homeowners and the renters. And that's why we tell people, if you've been affected, call us, 1-800-621-3362. And you have to the 29th of August. That is the deadline for the individual assistance.
So the hail damage to my garden isn't covered?
Well, the declaration calls for flooding, but like in North and South Dakota, they got straight line winds, derechos, flooding, tornadoes. So it's articulated in the request what that specific was. And if hail was part of it, and then you were impacted, then yes, you could apply for that.
Montana is really not known for flooding. It's somewhat unusual. We've had terrible forest fires, but I guess, do you see disasters happening because of climate change, dare I say?
I think so. I think we're starting to see that. We're seeing tornadoes more hitting Iowa and Wisconsin, what usually maybe like in Oklahoma. The traditional area, it seems like the jet stream is changing. So there's a lot of factors, but regardless, one of the 3 major strategic goals in FEMA, besides establishing equities as a foundation of emergency management, climate resiliency, third part is ready the nation for disasters, and that's internally and externally. We need people to speak up. And like he said, if you've been impacted, I think there are people don't trust the government, people don't have phones, people don't have internet, people are not familiar who to call. Fromberg particularly, there's not an infrastructure, they've not been talked with, there's no plan. So those are things that we learn, and then we document that, and we're like, how do we make this place better? How do we improve that capacity? How do we bring Montanans together to plan for each other, right? At that local level, the county level, the state level, and then that's where federal government comes in and helps.
Mike, do you have suggestions for people that are living with disabilities, whether it's a wheelchair, a hearing disability, a lot of the people that we serve have emotional disabilities or have cerebral palsy or a various aspects. Are there things that you would suggest people do just to be prepared for a potential disaster?
Yeah, so I got to plug Aaron Titus. He is president of a Rocky Mountain FOAD, the Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters. He wrote a book called How to Prepare for Everything. And really the bottom line is that you don't want to talk about evacuation. What would disrupt your life? What would you lose? How do you prepare? What resources do we, because we all have something. We all have something that if we lost it, it could be impactful to us, as we evacuate, what have you. So it's to look at your life and to find out what is it that I depend on to have that independence, and if I lost it, what is that outcome? And then communicate that to planning. There are multiple layers of doing that, but the main thing is that we need people to speak up, and not everybody's willing to do that. Deaf people have a hard time going to a hearing community, or perhaps if you're blind, they don't have access, or like you said, a wheelchair, what have you. We need people to get out and be that voice, and so planners, they don't know what they don't know, so they end up planning for instead of planning with. Mm-hmm. And so as we get those voices to the table and get them talking about what their needs are, there are many funding streams, many planning capabilities, there's many emergency assistance compacts the states have with each other, that we can find those gaps, those resources to meet that gap, to give people a chance. But again, your voice has to be heard, and we encourage people to come out, talk to your local emergency planner, get involved, and if you've been impacted by it, please register before the registration. It's better to register and find out you don't qualify than to find out later, I should have registered and the deadline passed.
Tony, tell me again about the registration and the deadlines on that.
Okay, first, to register, there's a couple ways you can register. You can call our 800 number, which is 800-621-3362.
And that's just FEMA, so people could find it if they could Google it and
Yes.
get that number? Okay.
Yes, and they also, when they're online, they can go to disasterassistance.gov and register online. Mm-hmm. They can download our app, or they can come visit us in person. We have a couple registration sites. We call them disaster recovery centers. We have one at the United Way here in Yellowstone County, at the Methodist Church in Fromberg and Coburn County. We have a couple others that'll be closing, like our office in Red Lodge will be closing this weekend. It'll be closing tomorrow, actually. Mm-hmm. And those are the major ways that you can register. So the 29th of August is the deadline.
So people still have a couple of weeks, and it's important to be registered in advance of that deadline.
Yes, definitely. And then I also want to say, if you have registered and you got a letter from FEMA, and it's called a determination letter, and you get this letter and it may say you may not be eligible or you are eligible. If you're not, if it says, oh, you may not be eligible, but it'll tell you why, and then it may be you forgot, we need further information, we need more paper. It's not the end, because a lot of people say they got the letter, oh, I'm not eligible, they throw it away. No, call us. We can help you. We want to make sure that you get the vital assistance you need, because here's a couple things people haven't thought about. Their wells. A lot of people, the water came, it filled their wells. Their wells might have been contaminated. Their septic systems, their HVAC, the bridges, some of the roads, semi-public roads. Those are things that right now you're like, I can work through that.
It's not just, oh, good, the water's gone down.
Correct.
I keep thinking of things like mold in homes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or it's a bigger picture and it's a longer time frame when mm-hmm. disasters hit, in terms of thinking a big picture. You mentioned something, Mike, that I thought was interesting. People sometimes forget how important electricity is if they're on a ventilator. I mean, mm-hmm. is there backup systems available? Those are the kind of things that people need to be thinking about. And it may not be a disaster. It could be electricity goes out.
Right. No, and again, it's all about planning. It's understanding what your gaps are, and if you have a power dependency, we do have data. We try to do that analytics and try to figure out where they are, and we try to communicate that with our state and local partners. But it really takes the people to talk about that, because they think about could we do a mitigation project funding people with generators and gas. But with the rising cost of gas, what can you afford? If it's like 3 days, great. But what if you have a 2-week power outage in the middle of winter and you can't get to the gas station? You only have 3 days supply. That's your gap, right? So that's what we need to be thinking about. And then just one more thing, circling back to him talking about the registration. In that registration, we need people to identify, do you have a disability? Because my mom, being deaf, would not say she has a disability. She thinks the rest of the world does because they can't communicate with her. But no, please let us know if you have a disability and if you need something, a sign language interpreter or text or some other accommodation that you need so that we can acquire that, because we don't know what we don't know. But we want to make sure that we're providing equal access to everyone to the programs he's talking about.
Right. It's wonderful to think that it all begins with a question, and there are no wrong questions. If people are concerned about a disaster that's happened, the recovery aspect of it, you can only do so much until they present those questions to you.
I think, if I may, just real quickly, COVID, you mentioned COVID before. The economics, the gas prices, people moving. COVID a lot of people are leaving the West Coast to come to Montana because it's big sky, right? What is the impact to the people here in Montana having that income come in? Are we able to keep up? Are resources that people thought were plentiful now become suddenly, I have to wait in line for something because they don't have the capacity at the LIFTT, for example, stuff like that. So there's, COVID is still a thing, disaster planning, all of these factors play in. So it really takes all of us. It is the whole community. And if we can all work together, then we can start to identify where our strengths and weaknesses are. And then we can strategize in finding ways to fill those gaps, those weaknesses.
So I guess what I've learned from this session today, gentlemen, is that disasters happen and you deal with them, but people need to be thoughtful in advance of that. And particularly, people with disabilities need to be aware of the circumstance they're in and how they might have to deal with a disaster.
Yes, you need to be your own best advocate, and you need to have a plan. You can't always plan for everything, but, plan for the things you need. Like Mike was saying earlier, I know I need a ventilator. What am I going to do if something happens? Those are things you got to think about. What happens if I have to leave my home for a week? If my home gets burned down by a fire, we're in wildfire season.
Right.
If I got oxygen, what's going to happen if I'm going to need new oxygen? Things like that. You just need to plan and think ahead, just for your own protection and be your own best advocate. But then when you do go to those recovery centers, say, hey, I have a disability. This is what I need.
The other thing too, if I could real quick, I know we're running out of time, but it's like, think about places like Silvergate and Cook City. There's only
Gardner.
and there's only one paved road that's paved, like snow plowed. And if that road is not gonna, they're hoping to have it open again by October kind of thing, but because winter in Montana is a thing, right? So from October to April or May, if they're not able to do any construction, and there's only one paved snow plowed road into those areas, think about that long term. What does that mean for deliverables and things of that nature, all the things that we talked about today. So there's plenty of scenarios to be thinking about, and that's why planning is fun, because you can talk about all these things,
right,
and try to come up with the best plan. And then the disaster happens, you integrate, you implement it.
You're a little ahead of the game.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, exactly.
Gentlemen, thank you for being here. We've had representatives from FEMA today helping us understand disaster recovery.